Hi, welcome back to another episode of the Q. My name is Lisa Maroney. I'm the Director of Business Development for the town of Chelmsford, and we're back here again with my co-hosts, Jen and Karen. Welcome back. And today we've got some special guests for our show from Trinity Ambulance. Karen had suggested a great idea that we'd love to learn and hear from first responders during the pandemic of COVID-19, and I did write down a short list of questions myself to ask. And with us from Trinity is Kirk, Brigham, and Erin, Garnder. They are both paramedics with Trinity Ambulance, so this should be a great conversation and have some excellent answers to all of our burning questions on the queue for Trinity Ambulance. So I guess I'm just going to start with one of my questions, and we all have kind of some obvious stuff about PPE and things like that, but lucky me, I did have to call 911 about 3 weeks ago for a unexpected incident at my home where someone fell backwards off of some scaffolding, and it was kind of scary. So I called 911 right away, and the first thing they asked me was, does the patient have a fever? And I'm in a panic, and I'm on the phone with 911, and I don't have a thermometer. I don't know if they have a fever. I'm calling because they fell backwards on the ground, and I said no, but I actually didn't really know if they had a fever. But you know, I understand that question, but do you have any thoughts as to how that now plays out to 911 and emergency calls where you've got COVID mixed in, and how do you keep everybody safe and have the same response? And it's just very complicated. I'm going to pass it over to Kirk and Erin to kind of fill us in with some of that.
So going back to your incident where they asked you if the patient had a fever, take us back to February, and that question would not have been asked. That wouldn't even come off of the dispatcher's lips. And that question is a direct result of the ongoing pandemic. So you see, it has changed our emergency dispatch protocols at their very basic. From the very start, we're already asking questions related to COVID-19. Which, again, take us back to February, and we weren't asking any of those questions. You would have to call in and say that you felt ill and you felt feverish for us to even ask for that type of information. So the world is definitely a different place, and it all happened within 3 months. Now we're in our third month of this pandemic. It significantly altered the way that our daily routine as well. Out in the streets, we're wearing more and more of the PPE, as you mentioned, and we're wearing it for every call. We've instituted a policy where every single call, regardless of what it's for, so it could be a motor vehicle accident, it could be somebody who fell, it could be somebody with a fever, but they're going to get two fully dressed up and gowned EMTs with goggles on and the mask. And sometimes if they're pre-screened and they say that somebody has a fever in the house, we'll come with the big Darth Vader stormtrooper looking mask called an N100. And the EMTs or paramedics will be wearing those into some higher risk calls, or if they have to perform a high risk procedure. But it's definitely a significant change.
I think it's really worth making very clear that when you call 911, whether you have a fever or not, they will come.
Yes, that has not changed. That has not changed one bit. You get the same response calling 911 in February that you get now. It's just you'll get asked different questions, the questions that have changed. And that's all to prepare the first responders coming to your house. So we can better prepare them and try to reduce the number of people that actually walk in and make patient contact. Because as you know, sometimes people, when they call 911, they say, well, a police truck showed up, a fire truck showed up, an ambulance showed up. Why do I need all these people? And that's kind of what we stepped back and said, okay, we're still going to send everybody, but not everybody has to walk into the house. So some of them may still stay outside and only go in if needed. But everybody's wearing the same level of protection.
Good point, because I did notice the amount of response that shows up. But, you know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about that some of this may be permanent in a way to protect the first responder and the emergency response, because it's such close contact and as care direct for patients like that. So now I can't even envision a paramedic or a first responder coming without mask and gloves on.
I agree, and it changed in the course of a few months, really. I would say back in February, the only calls in which we would actually don the mask on would be if they're pre-screened as a high-risk patient, somebody with tuberculosis or somebody with flu-like symptoms. If I was entering the scene, I would put that mask on beforehand. But now, every call, every time, regardless. We are both supervisors here or managers here at Trinity. And if we see our ambulances driving around in the streets without a patient in the back, and you have the 2 EMTs in the front, they're supposed to have masks on themselves, because you can't social distance in the cab of an ambulance. You can't remain that 6 feet apart. So they're supposed to be wearing masks. So we'll be driving down the street and I'll look for every ambulance. I'll be like, hey, do they have their masks on? Hey, who was that? I'll call the dispatcher and say, hey, you need to speak to ambulance 16 because one of them didn't have a mask on.
It's that important. It
is
vital to be able to, you know, and honestly, sometimes I'm like, oh, I forgot my mask. And, you know, I'm like 10 feet away from my car going on an errand and I'm like, oh, my mask. I'm still not in that habit of it. And then there's other times where you look like you're out of place if you don't have your mask on and you're waiting in line somewhere, those types of things. But, you know, I'd like to kind of maybe hear from Jen a little bit in the social work that she's had to do during COVID and interacting with people in need and how that relates to the first responder in some way.
Yeah, so, you know, I certainly have had interactions with residents who are concerned about whether or not they might get the care that they need because of the pandemic. And I think some of those concerns are easing up a little bit from where they were, you know, in the early stages when everybody was advised to kind of avoid, you know, hospital or ER visits if at all possible. But I'm curious, going back to the PPE, Kirk and Erin, if you can talk a little bit about, you know, how it's going right now, what your supplies are like for PPE. You know, we heard in the very early days about how difficult it was for first responders to even have access to PPE. I come from the healthcare world. I worked in ICU for 15 years, and I'm still in very close contact with a lot of my ICU friends who, you know, were telling me stories about them going and caring for COVID patients in the hospital and not having proper equipment. And, you know, everybody knows the story about Bob Kraft sending the Patriots plane to get PPE for Massachusetts. So tell us a little bit about what it was like early on and how things have evolved. And do you guys have the equipment that you need to have at this time?
So at first we were having some struggles, and then we were able to find a wide variety of products. So we have different sources that we get different items from. We were able to sign up for the Amazon medical marketplace where they send only to medical people. So that helped a little bit. But we have found connections throughout, you know, the state that we're able to purchase the PPE from.
And locally as well, here in Lowell. Right here in Lowell, we got a manufacturer in downtown Lowell to change their manufacturing process to make gowns for us. And they're now churning out about 10,000 gowns a day. They're down on Rock Street, and they're great. It's something that they didn't make 3 months ago.
That's almost been sort of one of the more uplifting stories, I think, that's come out of this whole pandemic is businesses that had to close down because of the pandemic sort of repurposing their manufacturing processes to be able to provide PPE for our first responders in hospitals. And I think that's a great thing.
I also have really appreciated the outpouring of homemade masks that have been dropped off and donated to us, as well as the food, of course. But we've been inundated with, 50 masks a day and lunch and dinner pretty much once or twice a week by either local businesses or just local people throughout the community who have donated those items to us. And we really appreciate that. That has been awesome. The outpouring of that generosity.
So it sounds like people can rest assured that, when a first responder is coming to their home, if they need to, that they're going to be properly outfitted in the PPE that they need, because it sounds like you guys are getting what you need now. It took a little bit to get there, but.
We are definitely. I would say we're not 100% caught up. We can't get it through our normal channels in which we got it back in February. But we've found alternate channels, and the state also has provided us with a limited amount of PPE as well.
So I want to kind of turn this back over to Karen a little bit. She was talking earlier about as she provides services through Visiting Angels and the owner of Visiting Angels, and her interest to learn a little bit about how first responder and volumes and types of calls may have changed based on COVID, and just not basic help, but the recurring falls or patients that maybe call 911 a little bit more often than others. And Karen, do you have any other comments you want to add into the idea of maybe additional needs for the elderly and first responders, and how this has changed a little bit during the pandemic?
Sure. Kirk and I were talking before we started recording about if the number of falls calls from seniors has risen during this time. A lot of seniors are isolated now from their families because of the quarantine, and so there's not someone nearby to support them if they lose their balance. And so I was just talking to Kirk about maybe have the calls increased from our senior population due to falls during this time.
Yeah, and we talked about, definitely we are summons to the house a lot more because of family members who cannot make it out, who are either in quarantine or just don't want to have that close contact. So we're seeing an increase in frequency of those responding to addresses for that. But the overall in the system here, the one thing we noticed is motor vehicle accidents are down. We're doing a lot fewer motor vehicle accidents, but we saw an increase in the complaints of shortness of breath and chest pain, which you'd assume comes along with the COVID type complaints. And we saw a reduction in the early stages of our psychological emergencies and our repeat people who repetitively take trips to the hospital. And then a few weeks later, it ticked back up. Our psychological emergency calls ticked back up, and our frequent patients going to the hospital ticked back up. So I don't know if it's confidence in, or they just delayed that care that they needed and decided, you know what, I'm tired of hearing about the COVID thing. I want to go to the emergency room. I need to go to the emergency room now. It's interesting.
Yeah. Kirk, you and I were also talking about, you said your total number of calls, your sort of volume is down 30%. And that begs the question, are less people experiencing emergencies now? Are there less heart attacks? Like, is it less stressful to stay at home and not have the world coming at you all the time? So are heart attacks down, or accidents down because people are doing less, or what do you think's going on here?
So you kind of assume that strokes and heart attacks wouldn't change with a COVID pandemic. Your rates of heart attacks and strokes would stay the same. And I guess what we're seeing is a lot of people are less likely to go to the hospital, maybe out of fear of contracting a virus while at the hospital. And so we saw our transports down for those types of emergencies. But one interesting thing that I had thought of when you were talking about it, and I've already lost my train of thought.
I guess what we have been talking about was that people really are still having heart attacks and strokes.
Yeah.
And the problem is that they're not calling for emergency help because they are afraid of going to the hospital. And so I think it's important that we reiterate here for our listeners is that, we started this quarantine to sort of take the pressure off of our hospitals and our first responders and not have a backup there where they were overwhelmed. And the quarantine has really worked well to flatten the curve of a number of COVID cases we've had in the hospitals now have a little bit of breathing room, and they can take in emergency calls, that there is room for people who think they're having a heart attack or think that they're having a stroke. And I think it's really important that people still be aware of COVID and still be cautious about it, but there are other health factors that we all need to be aware of, and we need to take care of our whole selves and get beyond that. I can't go to the hospital because I don't want to get COVID fear, because we don't want people dying in their homes of heart attacks or strokes either.
Yes, I agree. They should have the confidence to know that precautions are in place at the hospitals and in the back of the ambulance, that they're not going to get COVID in those environments. If anything, it's the opposite. There are so many precautions that are taken, especially with isolation rooms and distancing and visitors not allowed at the hospitals. They should just have the confidence in knowing that we can take care of those issues, and they should be calling 911, as you said.
I think it's interesting, Kirk, too, that you mentioned that you initially saw a downtick in mental health calls, but now that it's coming back up, and I, that's not unexpected to me, because I know for me in my office, I have received a lot more calls from folks who are experiencing, whether it be new mental health symptoms or exacerbation of existing symptoms, as a result of anything from, the actual illness of COVID itself and fear and anxiety over that to, loss of job and loss of economic security and things like that. So I wonder, as time goes on, we're reopening the state now and businesses are starting to come back up, but we're still experiencing an extremely high unemployment rate. And I wonder, it'll be interesting to see, and I don't even know if you might have an idea of this or a prediction of this, whether or not you might for a little while see the mental health calls continue to trend upwards a little bit.
Yeah, I'd imagine we would. We've definitely seen an uptick in our domestic calls, domestics and alcohol related, because the one thing we all know that have been open this whole entire time are the package stores. Right. And, it's unfortunate that we get called into these situations, but we did see an increase in frequency in domestic related calls and alcohol related calls. Right. For sure.
I think that's kind of an opportunity for me to give a little plug for my services that, this, in a time of crisis like this is where hopefully my, position in my office can be helpful to folks where, certainly people are reaching out to me, but I think there are a lot of people out there who aren't reaching out, partially because they just don't know where to turn to for help. So, I work closely with our police and fire chiefs to kind of work towards being able to get folks who are calling first responders for mental health issues and even substance use related issues, the help that they need so that they don't have to call you guys for that. Because as much as helpful as you folks are, we also want to make sure that our first responders are available to people who are having medical emergencies that need, emergent, timely medical care. So.
Definitely. And with the nothing changed with the opioid crisis, right? I mean, back in January, that's the pandemic that we had been dealing with here, was the opioid crisis. And it's not that it took a back burner to say, but it's definitely still ongoing. It's still an ongoing issue. And we're still seeing about almost 4 overdoses a day in our communities that we service, and that has not changed. It also has not risen, and it fluctuates.
Mhm.
You know, some months we'll see 1 to 2 opioid-related incidents a day versus 3 to 4. So still ongoing, even in a COVID pandemic. It's like layer after layer after layer.
Right. And so, I mean, it's a lot of important information of what you've been sharing. And what I'm learning as I hear the discussion is how much of a network is here in Chelmsford that is maybe not as well known, because Lowell has a lot of the base of the prominence in this area with being such a large city. But in the town of Chelmsford, we have a lot of medical agencies here, a lot of resources, a lot of people here to serve the needs and health and welfare and the older population with Karen's work, and a lot of human services that are coming out of Chelmsford. And I just want to point out before we wrap up the show that I think about a year ago, or at maybe 10 months ago or so, Trinity had renovated and created that great location that you have here in Chelmsford on North Road, I think is the typical address. And we had an excellent opening and ribbon cutting of that event. Wonderful facility that you have right there, which is all the modernized resources and things like that. So I just want to say thank you to Trinity for pursuing and finding a location here based in Chelmsford. And I just appreciate all that you've done for the community, and including bringing your schedule and time with us today. We'd love to keep in contact with you, and we're all of us here are always ready to talk about new ideas or initiatives, things like that, and ways to reach out to the community in need. So if there's any last words anybody wants to add before we wrap up today's show.
Yeah, I'll just add my thanks to Lisa's thanks. Trinity has been a good partner to me in my position, and I work closely with John Kelly and some of the task forces, and so I'm happy that you're here and that you're available to residents, and it's good that people can see from today's show that you're ready to get out and help them if they need it. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, my thank you. I hope that you guys see all the signs around town that say thank you, frontline workers, and that you take it to heart, that everyone in our community really appreciates that you're still out there doing your job, and doing it, even in these, even better, like it's even harder with the PPE, but you're still doing it, and you guys both seem to have really good attitudes, and we just want to say thank you, and I hope you appreciate the thanks from the community.
We do. We like I said, we've seen an outpouring from the community more than we ever have, and really appreciate that. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I think that wraps up another episode of The Q, and thank you so much, everyone, for all of your time, and looking forward to our show for next week. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.